Rain hammered the streets of downtown Chicago, turning the sidewalks into rivers of reflected neon. Olivia Bennett stood under the narrow awning of her office building, phone gripped tightly, eyes locked on the little car icon crawling toward her on the map. She'd been at the office since 7 that morning, buried under spreadsheets for the charity's annual financial audit, and her feet ached from 12 straight hours in the same pair of flats. She was plus size, with soft curves she'd stopped apologizing for years ago, dark curly hair now frizzing from the humidity, and tired eyes that still managed to look sharp every time she scanned a column of numbers. Numbers were her comfort zone. People, less so, especially on nights like this, when all she wanted was to get home, eat something warm, and forget the mess of financial records she'd been drowning in. 2 black SUVs pulled up almost at the exact same moment, headlights cutting twin beams through the rain. Olivia didn't check the license plate. She didn't check the driver's face. She just yanked open the back door of the nearest one and slid inside, already exhaling with relief at being out of the storm. "Finally," she muttered, dropping her bag beside her. "You would not believe the day I've had." The man sitting across from her didn't answer right away. He watched her for a moment, unreadable, dressed in a dark tailored coat that fit like it had been made for him, because it had. Ethan Carter was 28, built like someone who still trained hard despite running half a dozen companies, with a small tattoo curling along the side of his neck that most people mistook for reckless youth. It wasn't. It was a reminder of a promise he'd made to himself a long time ago, one he never talked about. He said nothing. He simply let her talk. Olivia was already pulling her laptop bag onto her knees, scrolling through a folder of scanned documents on her phone, venting the way people do when they assume they're alone with a stranger who has no stake in what they're saying. "So we're doing the annual audit for the foundation, right? And everything's supposed to be routine. Boring even. But there's this pattern I keep seeing in 3 of the donor accounts. Money comes in, gets split into these weird small transfers, moves through 2 other charities that barely operate, and then it just vanishes, like it never existed." She laughed, tired and a little bitter. Probably just bad bookkeeping. Somebody's intern made a mess 3 years ago, and nobody's cleaned it up since. "I'll deal with it tomorrow." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew exactly what she was describing. He'd seen the same layered movement of funds surface twice in the last 2 months, tangled somewhere in the edges of his own logistics network, dismissed by his accountants as clerical noise. Except it wasn't noise. It was a pattern, deliberate and careful, built by someone who understood exactly how to make money disappear without triggering a single alarm. He didn't interrupt her. He wanted to hear more. Olivia kept going, oblivious, describing timestamps and transfer amounts with the kind of detail that only someone who'd spent years staring at ledgers could produce from memory. She complained about her manager brushing off her concerns. She complained about the rain. She complained about Uber drivers who didn't say a single word the entire ride, which, she said with a small laugh, she actually appreciated tonight because she was too tired for small talk. It was the leather seats that finally stopped her. She glanced up, taking in the interior properly for the first time, the stitched leather, the quiet hum of a car that clearly cost more than her entire apartment building, the faint scent of cedar and rain-damp wool. Her stomach dropped. "This isn't my Uber." "No," Ethan said, calm, almost amused. "It isn't." Olivia's face went red with horror. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. I didn't even look. There were 2 cars and I just..." She was already fumbling for the door handle, mortified, apologizing in rapid bursts while gathering her bag. "It's fine," Ethan said, and something in his voice made her pause. Steady, unbothered. Not the reaction she expected from a man in a car like this. "The weather's bad tonight, Let my driver take you home." "That's really not necessary." "It is," he said simply, already texting his driver the address she reluctantly gave him. "I have somewhere to be, but there's no reason you should be standing on a curb waiting for another ride in this." She stared at him for a moment, unsure what to make of the kindness, before murmuring a quiet thank you and stepping out into the rain toward the second SUV. The door shut. The car pulled away. And that was supposed to be the end of it. A strange, forgettable 5 minutes in an otherwise exhausting day. Except Olivia's bag had shifted during the confusion, and a small flash drive, the one holding her backup copies of the audit files, had slipped out and rolled beneath the seat. Ethan noticed it after she was gone. He turned it over once in his fingers, studying the faded initials someone had written on the side in permanent marker. He hadn't caught her name. He hadn't asked for it. But he had a feeling, sitting there in the quiet hum of the car, that he was going to find out. Ethan didn't open the flash drive. He turned it over twice in his study that night, curiosity nagging at him, but he set it on his desk instead and left it untouched until morning. Whatever was on it belonged to a woman he'd known for exactly 5 rain-soaked minutes, and something about the way she'd spoken, so openly, so unguarded, made him want to return it the right way. He called his head of technology first thing. "I need you to find the owner of this device," he said, sliding it across the desk. "Don't open any personal files. Just match the contact information stamped on the drive itself to a name and address. That's all." Within the hour, he had a name: Olivia Bennett, forensic accountant, working out of a small nonprofit called Hearthline Charitable Foundation on the edge of the loop. He could have sent someone. He had assistants for that. Drivers, a dozen people whose job it was to handle small errands like this one. Instead, he found himself getting into his car that afternoon and heading there himself, telling nobody the real reason why. Hearthline's office was modest, tucked into the second floor of an older building, with creaky stairs and the faint smell of coffee that had been reheated one too many times. Olivia was at her desk when he walked in, hair pulled back, sleeves pushed up, surrounded by 3 monitors and a stack of paper folders that looked like they'd multiplied overnight. She looked up and nearly knocked over her coffee. "You're the—" she started, then stopped herself, flustered. "You're the car. I mean, the wrong car, last night." "Ethan," he said, setting the flash drive gently on her desk. "You left this behind." Olivia stared at it like it was a small miracle. "I didn't even realize it was gone. I've been trying to piece together files all morning because half my backups from last week just disappeared." She rubbed her temple. "This has not been a good week." "Disappeared how?" She hesitated, unsure how much to say to a stranger, however polite he'd been the night before. But something about the calm way he asked, like he genuinely wanted the details and not just a polite answer, made her relax slightly. "Digital records. Files I know I saved. Gone from the shared drive overnight. I thought maybe I was losing my mind, but I checked the access logs, and someone was in the system around 2 in the morning. Nobody works here at 2 in the morning." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. He glanced past her toward the small back office where the filing cabinets sat, noticing the drawer that wasn't quite pushed shut, the faint scuff marks near the lock that a careless observer would miss entirely. Has anyone else noticed unusual activity? Deliveries? Visitors? Anyone with after-hours access? Why does that matter to you? He considered his answer carefully. He wasn't ready to tell her everything. Not the shipments, not the transactions bleeding into his own companies, not the unease that had been building in him for 2 months. Not yet. Not to someone he'd known for less than a day. "Because what you described in the car last night," he said instead. "The transfers moving through shell charities, money disappearing into nothing. That's not sloppy bookkeeping. That's a method. And methodical people don't usually stop after one mistake." Olivia's mouth opened, then closed. She hadn't expected him to remember the details so precisely, let alone take them seriously. Most people, when she tried explaining financial irregularities, glazed over within 30 seconds. "You actually listened to all that," she said slowly. "I did." She studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the calm, expensive-looking man in front of her with someone who apparently paid close attention to the ramblings of an exhausted stranger in the back of his own car. It didn't fit the image she had of wealthy businessmen, the ones who barely acknowledged the people serving their coffee, let alone remembered a rushed monologue about donor accounts. "I run several companies," Ethan said, choosing his words with care. "One of them handles cybersecurity for a handful of nonprofits and small businesses. Given what you're describing, missing records, unauthorized access, I'd like to have my team take a look. No cost to your organization. Financial fraud tends to target places like this precisely because nobody expects anyone to be watching closely." Olivia crossed her arms, the accountant in her instantly suspicious of anything offered for free. "And what do you get out of it?" It was a fair question, and Ethan almost smiled at how quickly she'd cut through the pleasantries to ask it. "Honestly, I'm curious," he admitted. "The pattern you described matches something I've seen recently, somewhere I didn't expect to see it. I'd like to understand it better, consider it mutual benefit." She waited in silence, glancing toward the back office, where months of careful work now felt fragile, half erased by someone she couldn't see. The board would ask questions if donor records kept vanishing. Funding could dry up. People who depended on Hearthline's programs, the shelters, the meal services, the youth mentorship funding, none of them would care about the technical explanation if the money stopped coming. "Fine," she said finally, reluctant but firm. "But I want to see everything your team finds. No summaries, no skipped details. If something's happening to my organization, I want to know all of it." Agreed. She stuck out her hand, businesslike, already retreating into the version of herself that felt safest, the accountant, not the woman who'd rambled to a stranger in the rain. Ethan shook it, and neither of them mentioned how oddly formal it felt after the accidental intimacy of the night before. As he turned to leave, Olivia called after him. "Ethan," he glanced back. "Thank you for bringing the drive back. You didn't have to come yourself." He paused at the doorway a moment longer than necessary. "I know," he said, and left it at that. Neither of them said it aloud, but something had shifted, quiet and unspoken, the beginning of something neither of them had planned for when the rain started falling the night before. The cybersecurity team arrived at Hearthline 2 days later, quiet and efficient, running diagnostics on servers that hadn't been touched since the office first got Wi-Fi installed. They found traces of the intrusion easily enough, an outside connection routed through 3 different servers to hide its origin, but the trail went cold fast. Whoever had accessed the system knew exactly how to disappear. "They're good," said Marcus, the lead technician, frowning at his screen. "Not amateur good, professional good." Olivia sat across from him, arms folded, watching numbers scroll past. That meant nothing to her. This wasn't her world. Hers was columns and ledgers, patterns hidden in decimal points, not firewalls and IP addresses. She felt useless in a way she wasn't used to feeling, and it irritated her more than she expected. "So what do we actually have?" she asked. "Not much on the digital side," Marcus admitted. "But whoever did this left the physical records untouched. If there's a paper trail, it's probably still intact." That was where Olivia came in. Over the following week, she and Ethan's small team of financial investigators began combing through everything the digital wipe hadn't reached. Paper invoices stuffed in storage boxes, old donation receipts from fundraising galas 3 years back, shipping manifests that, on the surface, had nothing to do with a nonprofit's finances at all. It wasn't dramatic work. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no single document that cracked the case wide open. Instead, it was slow, patient, and often tedious. Dozens of tiny inconsistencies that meant nothing on their own but started forming a shape when laid side by side. A donation processed on a Tuesday that matched, almost to the dollar, a transfer out of an unrelated shell charity on a Thursday. A warehouse receipt with a delivery date that lined up suspiciously well with a spike in donor activity. The investigation took them across Chicago in ways Olivia hadn't expected. A gala on the near North Side, where she watched Ethan quietly slip an extra tip to a valet who mentioned his daughter was starting college in the fall. An accounting firm downtown, where he remembered the receptionist's name from a single introduction weeks earlier and asked how her recovery from surgery was going. A cramped storage facility on the South Side, where he helped an elderly employee lift a box without being asked, then thanked him twice for his time, like the man was doing him a personal favor rather than his job. It kept catching her off guard. "You don't have to do that, you know," she told him one afternoon after he'd spent a full 5 minutes chatting with a shipping clerk about the man's motorcycle instead of rushing through the paperwork they'd come for. "Do what?" "Be nice to people who don't matter to your bottom line." Ethan looked at her, genuinely puzzled by the comment. "Everyone matters to somebody's bottom line, Olivia. That's usually the problem." She didn't have a response for that. It sat with her the rest of the day, quietly dismantling assumptions she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The ones built from years of watching wealthy donors sweep through Hearthline's fundraisers, shaking hands for photos, and disappearing the moment the cameras stopped flashing. Ethan wasn't like that. Or if he was, he hid it better than anyone she'd ever met. For his part, Ethan found himself watching Olivia work with something close to fascination. She had a way of staring at a spreadsheet for 10 minutes, in total silence, mumbling numbers under her breath, before suddenly sitting up straight and circling 3 entries that, to everyone else, looked completely unrelated. Half the time she couldn't fully explain why something felt wrong. It just did. And more often than not, she turned out to be right. "How did you catch that?" he asked one evening, after she'd flagged a transaction buried inside a stack of 40 nearly identical donation records. The software his team used hadn't flagged it. 3 trained analysts had scanned right past it. Olivia shrugged, a little embarrassed by the attention. "The rounding's off, just slightly. Real donations almost never land on numbers that clean. This one's too perfect. Somebody built it to look real instead of letting it just be real." Ethan studied her for a long moment. Not the transaction, her. The tired eyes that lit up the moment numbers were involved. The way she tucked a curl behind her ear without thinking whenever she concentrated. The quiet confidence that showed up only when she stopped worrying about how she was perceived and simply did the thing she was good at. He'd spent years surrounded by people trying to impress him, executives padding their reports, business partners exaggerating their successes, women at galas who laughed a little too hard at things that weren't funny. Olivia didn't do any of that. She barely seemed to notice he had money at all, except as a resource that happened to include a cybersecurity team and useful contacts. She argued with him when she disagreed. She called out sloppy assumptions, his included, without hesitation. It was, he realized, somewhere between the 4th stakeout at a storage facility and a very long night, sorting through fundraising archives, refreshing in a way he hadn't expected. Olivia, meanwhile, was fighting her own quiet unraveling of expectations. She kept waiting for the moment Ethan would reveal himself as just another rich man playing at generosity, the mask slipping to show impatience, entitlement, the casual cruelty she'd seen from men in expensive suits before. The moment never came. If anything, the more time she spent with him, the more she noticed small things that didn't fit the image at all. how he remembered details about people's lives that had nothing to do with business, how he never once made her feel foolish for asking basic questions about servers and firewalls, how he genuinely seemed to enjoy watching her work rather than simply tolerating it. By the end of the week, they'd filled 2 folders with inconsistencies, cross-referenced against dozens of locations across the city. None of it added up to a clear picture yet, but something was there, buried under layers of careful manipulation, and both of them had started to feel it. Neither one said anything about the way their partnership had begun to feel like something more than professional. Not yet. There was still too much mystery left unsolved, and both of them, in their own way, were too cautious to name something before they understood exactly what it was. The pattern became impossible to ignore by the second week. Every time Olivia reconstructed a missing financial record, painstakingly piecing it together from old invoices and cross-referenced bank statements, the related document would vanish before she and Ethan's team could examine it properly. A shipping manifest she'd flagged on Monday was gone from the archive by Wednesday. A donor file she'd rebuilt from 3 separate sources disappeared from the shared server less than a day after she mentioned it out loud during a meeting. At first, Marcus assumed it was another outside intrusion, the same kind of skilled hacker who'd wiped the original files. But the deeper his team dug, the less that explanation made sense. Outside hackers don't move this precisely, he told Ethan one evening, spreading a timeline across the conference table in Ethan's office. Look at this. Olivia mentions a lead in a meeting Tuesday afternoon. The file's gone by Wednesday morning. That's not a random scan finding vulnerabilities. That's someone who knew exactly what she found and exactly where to go delete it. Ethan stared at the timeline, the pieces sliding into place with an unease he didn't like. Someone with authorized access. Has to be, Marcus said. Somebody inside the system, or close enough to it, who's hearing what Olivia finds almost as soon as she finds it. The realization changed the shape of the entire investigation. It stopped being a question of who had built the laundering scheme in the first place, some distant, faceless architect moving money through shell companies. It became a much closer, much more uncomfortable question. Who around them, right now, always seemed to know exactly where Olivia was looking next? Olivia took the news harder than Ethan expected. That means someone's been listening, she said quietly, sitting very still in her chair at Hearthline's office, the late afternoon light cutting long shadows across her desk. Every meeting, every conversation where I said out loud what I'd found, someone's been sitting right there, and I never noticed. It doesn't mean you missed something, Ethan said. It means they're careful. It means I've been careless. Her voice had an edge to it now, frustration turned inward, the way it often did with her, the accountant's instinct to find the error in her own work before looking anywhere else. I've been talking through everything in team meetings, typing notes straight into shared files. I basically handed them a map, then we stop handing them one. She looked up at him, and something in his calm certainty steadied her more than she wanted to admit. From that point on, Olivia changed her methods entirely. She bought a stack of plain notebooks from a drugstore near her apartment, cheap and unremarkable, and began keeping her real findings there instead of on any digital system. She wrote in a private shorthand only she could easily read, cross-referencing entries with page numbers instead of file names, leaving the shared drive populated with deliberately vague, half-finished notes that led nowhere important. It was slower. It was inconvenient. It also worked. Within days, the pattern of disappearing files began to break down. Whoever had been tracking her digital trail suddenly had nothing solid to follow. The vague notes on the shared drive sat untouched, because there was nothing worth deleting anymore. Meanwhile, Olivia's handwritten notebooks, carried in her bag everywhere she went, filled steadily with the real progress, safe from whatever unseen hand had been erasing her work. For the first time since the investigation began, their hidden opponent started making mistakes. It happened almost by accident. Marcus, still monitoring server activity out of habit, noticed a strange spike in traffic on a Thursday evening. Someone searching the shared drive repeatedly, digging through the same handful of vague, deliberately unhelpful files Olivia had left behind. The search pattern was frantic, almost desperate, cycling through folders that hadn't been touched in weeks. "They know something's changed," Marcus said, watching the activity log with a slow, satisfied smile. "They're looking for what she's actually finding, and they can't find it anymore." Ethan felt something shift in his chest, sharp and focused, the particular clarity that came whenever a problem finally started bending in his direction instead of against him. "Can you trace where the search is coming from?" "Partially. It's routed through the same masking system as before, so I can't get an exact location, but the access credentials used to get into the shared drive in the first place, those are legitimate. Whoever's doing this isn't breaking in from outside. They're logging in like they belong there." The words hung heavy in the room. Someone with legitimate access. Someone trusted enough to move freely through Hearthline systems, or close enough to Ethan's own network to understand exactly how his cybersecurity team operated. It wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows anymore. It was someone closer than either of them wanted to consider. Someone who had likely sat across a table from one of them at some point in the past few weeks, without either of them suspecting a thing. Olivia felt a chill settle over her that night as she walked home, notebook tucked carefully inside her bag, glancing over her shoulder more than once at nothing in particular. The city felt different now, less like a familiar backdrop and more like a place where anyone passing by could be watching, waiting, reporting back to someone she couldn't name. She called Ethan before she even reached her apartment. "I keep thinking about who's been in the room every time I talked about this," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "Board meetings, casual conversations at the office, even some of the places we've gone together this past week." "I've been thinking the same thing," Ethan admitted. "That's not comforting." "No," he agreed quietly. "It isn't." For a moment, neither of them said anything, the weight of the realization settling between them, even through the phone line. Whoever they were looking for wasn't hiding behind a screen, somewhere far away. They were close, embedded, patient enough to wait, and careful enough to almost never slip. But almost never wasn't the same as never, and for the first time since the investigation began, both of them understood that the hunter and the hunted had quietly, invisibly, changed places. Ethan had known for 3 days before he finally said it out loud. He'd found the connection late one night, alone in his office, cross-referencing shipment records from his own logistics division against the timeline Olivia had rebuilt in her notebooks. It was a small thing at first, a single warehouse transfer that lined up too neatly with one of the suspicious donation cycles. Then he found a second, then a third. His companies hadn't built the laundering scheme. He was certain of that much. But somewhere along the way, without anyone in his organization realizing it, several of his logistics contracts had been used to move shipments timed suspiciously close to the fraudulent transactions Olivia kept uncovering. Legitimate cargo, legitimate paperwork, nothing that would raise a single flag on its own. But laid against her handwritten timeline, the pattern was unmistakable. He could have buried it. He had the resources to quietly investigate on his own, correct the problem internally, and let the rest of the case unfold without ever mentioning his own company's accidental involvement. Nobody outside his inner circle would have known. Instead, he told Olivia himself, the very next morning, before she had the chance to find it on her own. They were sitting in his office, late morning light spilling across the table between them, a spread of documents, and her open notebook between two cooling cups of coffee. Ethan set down the shipment records without preamble. "Before you go any further," he said, "there's something you need to see. My companies. Some of the shipments moving through the warehouses you've been tracking, they went through my logistics network." Olivia went very still. "How long have you known?" 3 days. She looked at him then, searching his face for the thing she'd been quietly bracing herself for since this investigation began. The moment he'd turn out to be exactly what she'd assumed wealthy men always were. Someone protecting his own interests. Someone willing to let a nonprofit take the fall while his own name stayed clean. But he wasn't hiding it. He wasn't minimizing it or wrapping it in careful language designed to soften the blow. He'd laid it out plainly, the moment he understood it himself, and he was watching her now, with the kind of steady honesty that made it hard to be angry at him, even though some part of her wanted to be. "You could have buried this," she said quietly. "I could have. Why didn't you?" Ethan considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, unwilling to give her a shallow answer just to smooth things over. "Because you'd have found it eventually. You always do. And when you found it, if I hadn't told you first, you'd have had every reason to think I was part of the problem instead of trying to solve it." Something in her chest loosened, slow and unexpected. She'd spent weeks watching him for cracks in the image, waiting for the version of him that matched every wealthy businessman she'd ever resented from a distance. Instead, he kept doing the opposite of what she expected, over and over, until the assumptions she'd been carrying started to feel less like protection and more like something she needed to let go of. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't complicate things," she said finally. "Your name is attached to shipments connected to a fraud investigation. That's not a small detail." "No, it isn't, which is exactly why I need it documented properly, by you, not buried by anyone trying to protect me." He leaned forward slightly. "I'd rather have this come out because we found it than have it come out because someone else did." Olivia studied him a long moment, then nodded slowly, picking her pen back up. "Then let's document it properly." The conversation, rather than fracturing the fragile trust they'd built over the past few weeks, seemed to deepen it instead. She noted the shipment details in her notebook without hesitation, the same careful precision she applied to every other entry, and Ethan didn't flinch once as she wrote his company's name into the same pages, holding evidence against a criminal network. If anything, watching her work through it so plainly, without drama, without treating him differently because of it, made him trust her more, not less. But the discovery came with a second, harder truth Ethan hadn't shared yet. If his shipments were connected to the scheme, someone inside his own extended network had to be involved. Someone with access to his logistics contracts, detailed enough to route cargo through the right warehouses at the right times. It wasn't a stranger exploiting a random vulnerability. It was someone who understood his business from the inside. He spent that evening quietly reviewing his own staff and contractors, the people who had access to shipment scheduling, contract details, warehouse assignments. Dozens of names, most of them people he'd trusted for years. Somewhere among them was someone feeding information to whoever was orchestrating the laundering scheme, and the thought sat uneasily in his chest, in a way few things did anymore. He didn't tell Olivia that part yet. Not because he was hiding it the way he might have hidden the shipment connection, but because he genuinely didn't know who it was, and he wasn't willing to name anyone based on suspicion alone. Accusing the wrong person, even quietly, even privately, felt like a mistake he couldn't afford to make. What he did tell her, later that night over the phone, was simpler. "This isn't just your investigation anymore," he said. "It's mine too. Whoever's inside my network, I need to find them just as much as you need to find whoever's inside yours." "Feels less like one mystery now," Olivia said, "and more like two mysteries that happen to be tangled together. Maybe they're not as separate as we think. She was quiet for a moment, turning that idea over. You think it's the same person? I think, Ethan said slowly, it would be a strange coincidence if it wasn't. Neither of them had proof yet, but the shape of something larger, something connecting Hearthline's missing records to Ethan's compromised shipments, had started forming in the space between them, and both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever came next would test not just their ability to solve numbers, but their ability to trust each other completely. Olivia's apartment was small, the kind of place where the radiator clanked at odd hours and the neighbor upstairs practiced piano badly, but with real enthusiasm. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and lately it had become the quiet command center of an investigation that no longer fit neatly inside office hours. She sat cross-legged on her couch on a Sunday night. 3 notebooks spread open across the coffee table, months of handwritten entries stretching back to the very first week after the flash drive incident. Ethan had offered to send his team over to help organize the data properly, run it through whatever software could spot patterns faster than a human eye. She'd turned him down. Some of this only makes sense on paper, she'd told him. I need to see it laid out, not sorted into a spreadsheet. She'd been staring at the same dozen pages for nearly 2 hours, tracing dates with her finger, cross-referencing donation timestamps against the shipment records Ethan had shared after their conversation about his logistics network. Something had been nagging at her for days, a feeling she couldn't quite name, the sense that she was looking at the right information but reading it wrong. Then, close to midnight, it clicked. She sat up so fast, she nearly knocked over her coffee mug. The suspicious transactions weren't random. She'd known that much for weeks. But she'd been treating them as isolated financial events, each one a piece of the laundering puzzle to be examined on its own. What she hadn't noticed, buried under the sheer volume of entries, was timing. Every single suspicious transaction occurred within a narrow window, usually 18 to 30 hours, before a large shipment moved between 2 specific warehouses. Not randomly distributed warehouses either. The same handful, cycling in a pattern she'd overlooked because she'd been focused on the money, not the cargo. She grabbed her phone and called Ethan without checking the time. He picked up on the second ring, voice rough with sleep, but alert immediately. Olivia? The transactions aren't just moving money, she said, words tumbling out faster than she could organize them. They're scheduling something. Every time one of the suspicious transfers happens, a shipment follows within a day, sometimes less, between the same set of warehouses. I've been treating the financial records like accounting entries this whole time, but they're not. They're acting like a code, like a calendar. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of Ethan sitting up, fully awake now. Say that again. She did, slower this time, walking him through the pattern entry by entry, warehouse by warehouse, the 18 to 30-hour window, repeating with a consistency that no coincidence could explain. By the time she finished, Ethan was quiet for a long moment. That's not laundering money for the sake of hiding it, he said finally. That's laundering money to fund something. The transactions aren't the end goal. They're payment for whatever's moving through those warehouses. The realization sat heavy between them, even over the phone. This wasn't simply about disappearing charity funds anymore. It was about what those funds were quietly financing, cycle after cycle, hidden inside shipments that looked, on paper, like nothing more than ordinary cargo moving between legitimate businesses. We need to see those warehouses, Olivia said. Not tonight, Ethan replied, and there was something protective in his voice that she didn't argue with. Tomorrow. Properly. I'll pull the transportation logs myself. The next few days took them out of Chicago entirely, following the pattern Olivia had uncovered into neighboring Illinois cities, where the warehouses were located, quiet industrial areas that drew no attention and asked no questions. They moved carefully, posing as compliance auditors when necessary, cross-referencing what they found on-site against Olivia's notebooks and the shipment records Ethan had gathered. It was slow, careful work, comparing warehouse inventories against transportation logs, matching donation schedules to delivery dates with a precision that left little room for coincidence anymore. In one facility outside Rockford, they found shipping records for cargo listed simply as industrial materials, with no further specification, moved on dates that matched 3 separate donation cycles almost to the hour. In another, near Aurora, a warehouse manager mentioned offhand that deliveries from a particular logistics contractor always arrived late at night, always unloaded quickly, always gone again before the morning shift began. Piece by piece, the picture that had eluded them for weeks began to take shape. Not a single dramatic reveal, but a slow accumulation of small, consistent details that no longer left room for innocent explanations. On the drive back from Aurora, Olivia sat with her notebook open on her lap, reviewing the timeline they'd built. Ethan drove in silence, letting her think, the city lights of Chicago starting to glow faintly on the horizon ahead of them. Whoever's running this isn't just moving money, she said eventually. They're running an entire operation through legitimate businesses, hiding shipments inside real cargo, using charity donations as a kind of hidden invoice system. That takes more than access to a few accounts. That takes someone who understands logistics and finance well enough to build a system that looks completely normal from the outside. Someone who's been doing this a long time, Ethan added quietly. Someone patient, Olivia said. Careful. The kind of person nobody would suspect, because they've spent years making sure nobody has a reason to. Ethan glanced at her briefly, before returning his eyes to the road. You have someone in mind. Not yet, she admitted. But I think we're close. Whoever this is, they've touched too many of these organizations for it to be a coincidence. There has to be a connection running through all of them, a person, not just a pattern. Then we find the person, Ethan said, and there was a new edge to his voice now, something sharper than the careful patience he'd shown throughout the investigation so far. Olivia looked out the window at the city drawing closer, the weight of what they'd uncovered sitting heavier than any of the financial mysteries she'd solved before. This wasn't just about restoring Hearthline's records anymore, or clearing Ethan's company's name. Somewhere out there was a person clever enough to build all of this, patient enough to hide it for years, and dangerous enough to have been watching their investigation closely enough to erase evidence before they could examine it. They were close. She could feel it in the same way she felt a number that didn't quite add up, a quiet, certain instinct that had never once led her wrong. Whoever it was, their carefully built world was about to start unraveling. The answer had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Ethan found it first, though he almost didn't recognize what he was looking at. He'd spent an entire evening building a list of every organization touched by the fraud. Hearthline, 2 smaller charities that had folded quietly over the past few years, 3 logistics contractors connected to his own network, an accounting firm that had lost a client under mysterious circumstances 18 months earlier. On paper, they had nothing in common. Different industries, different neighborhoods, different boards of directors. Except one name appeared, quietly, in the background of every single one. Gregory Hale, an independent financial consultant, semi-retired, the kind of man who showed up on advisory boards and quarterly review meetings without ever holding an official title. He'd worked with Hearthline years before Olivia joined, offering pro bono guidance during a rough financial stretch. He'd consulted briefly for one of Ethan's logistics contractors during a merger. He'd sat on the advisory panel for the accounting firm that lost its mysterious client. Nothing about any single connection looked suspicious. Together they formed a thread running quietly through every organization touched by the scheme. Ethan stared at the name for a long time before calling Olivia. "Gregory Hale," he said, the moment she picked up. "Does that name mean anything to you?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that Ethan almost asked again. When Olivia finally spoke, her voice had gone strange, quiet, and a little unsteady. "I was about to call you about the exact same name." She'd reached him through an entirely different path, working backward from the transaction timing patterns, rather than the organizational connections Ethan had traced. Hale's name had surfaced in old board meeting minutes from years earlier, buried in a line about a donated software system he'd recommended. One that, Olivia now realized, gave him quiet back-end access to Hearthline's financial records long after his official consulting arrangement had ended. Nobody had ever revoked the access. Nobody had thought to. Two completely different investigations, built from entirely different pieces of evidence, had arrived at the same name within hours of each other. "That's not a coincidence," Ethan said. "No," Olivia agreed, her voice steadying now, sharpening into the focused calm she got whenever a pattern finally resolved itself. "That's confirmation." They met that same night, spreading everything they had across Ethan's office table, cross-referencing Hale's history against every organization touched by the scheme. The picture that emerged was almost elegant in its patience. Hale had spent years quietly building trust across dozens of small and mid-sized organizations, always offering his services for free or at reduced rates, always positioning himself as the helpful outsider nobody thought twice about. He never held permanent positions. He never stayed long enough to attract scrutiny. He simply moved from organization to organization, leaving behind small vulnerabilities, a forgotten system access here, an overlooked account permission there, patient enough to let those openings sit dormant for years before quietly exploiting them. "He's not an accountant hiding fraud inside one company," Ethan said slowly, piecing it together as he spoke. "He's been building a network of access points across dozens of organizations for years, waiting until he had enough of them connected to actually use the system. And nobody ever suspected him," Olivia said, "because he never took anything directly. He just made himself useful enough that everyone trusted him, and then he disappeared before anyone thought to check what he left behind." It was, in its own quiet way, the most unsettling part of the entire investigation. Not a villain lurking in the shadows, but a man who had likely sat in board meetings, shaken hands, offered friendly advice, smiled at people who had no idea what he was quietly building around them. The realization sent a different kind of chill through Olivia than she'd expected. She thought back through years of board meetings, of small non-profit fundraisers, of the handful of times she'd heard Hale's name mentioned in passing as someone helpful, someone generous with his time. She'd never met him directly, but the fact that someone like that could move so easily through so many trusting organizations, undetected, unquestioned, made her feel a kind of retroactive unease she couldn't quite shake. Ethan felt something colder settle in his chest. Somewhere in his own extended business network, someone had been feeding Hale information about the investigation, tipping him off every time Olivia got close, every time her digital notes threatened to expose the pattern before she switched to her notebooks. That person was still out there, still connected to his companies, and Hale himself, sensing the walls closing in, wasn't likely to sit still much longer. He was right. Within 48 hours, reports started coming in from Marcus's team. Two of the shell companies connected to Hale's network had filed dissolution paperwork abruptly, their remaining assets liquidated and scattered across accounts that would take months to trace, if they could be traced at all. A small office space Hale had used occasionally for consulting meetings had been cleared out overnight. Filing cabinets emptied, computer systems wiped clean. He was running, or trying to. He's destroying everything he can reach, Ethan said grimly, reviewing the reports with Olivia beside him. Digital records, physical files, company registrations. He's covering his tracks as fast as possible. Olivia, however, didn't look as worried as he expected. She reached into her bag and set 3 notebooks on the table. Months of careful, handwritten documentation that existed nowhere else, untouched by any digital wipe or convenient office clearance. He can delete every file he wants, she said quietly. He doesn't know about these. He's been so focused on erasing the digital trail that he never once considered I stopped trusting digital records weeks ago. Ethan looked at the notebooks, then at her. Something between admiration and relief settling into his expression. The careful, almost stubborn instinct that had once felt like an inconvenience, switching to handwritten notes, working slower, trusting paper over software, had turned out to be the one thing Hale never accounted for. He's dissolving companies and wiping servers, Ethan said, and none of it matters, because you already wrote it all down. Olivia allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first real one in days. Turns out being a little old-fashioned has its uses. For the first time since the investigation began, they weren't chasing shadows anymore. They had a name, a pattern, and evidence Hale couldn't touch. The only question left was how to bring everything they'd found together before he managed to disappear completely. Ethan didn't call the police first. He called a meeting. Within 2 days, his conference room on the 32nd floor had filled with people from a dozen different corners of his world. Forensic auditors from one of his portfolio companies, the cybersecurity team that had started this whole process weeks earlier, 2 corporate attorneys who specialized in financial fraud, and a handful of representatives from the affected organizations, including Hearthline's board chair, who arrived looking nervous until she saw the sheer scale of documentation already spread across the table. Olivia stood at the head of the room, her 3 notebooks now photocopied and organized into color-coded sections. The same careful handwriting that had once felt like a private, almost stubborn habit, now serving as the backbone of an entire case. "We're not confronting anyone today," Ethan told the room, before anyone could ask. "We're documenting everything, completely, so that when we do move against Hale, there's no room left for him to argue, deny, or disappear into another shell company. This has to be airtight." For the next several days, the room barely emptied. Auditors cross-referenced Olivia's handwritten timeline against archived invoices pulled from storage units across 3 states. Cybersecurity specialists recovered partial backups from cloud servers Hale hadn't realized existed, remnants of donation records he'd assumed were permanently deleted. Attorneys built a legal framework around every transaction, making sure each piece of evidence would hold up long after Hale's lawyers inevitably tried to pick it apart. Olivia worked longer hours than she had during the entire investigation combined, fueled by coffee and a stubborn refusal to let a single detail slip through uncorrected. She walked auditors through her notebooks, page by page, explaining the shorthand only she fully understood, translating months of careful observation into a language the legal team could use. "This entry here," she said, pointing to a line dated months earlier, "matches the Rockford warehouse shipment. And this one connects to the donation that came through 2 days before it. If you line up all 3 columns, the pattern's undeniable." One of the auditors, a sharp older woman named Diane, who'd spent 30 years untangling corporate fraud, looked up from the notebook with something like genuine respect. "You built all of this by hand?" "Digital records kept disappearing," Olivia said simply. "Paper doesn't disappear as easily." "No," Diane agreed. "It doesn't, and frankly, it saved this entire case." Ethan watched from across the room, more than once during those long days, struck by how naturally Olivia had stepped into a role far bigger than the one she'd started with. She wasn't just the accountant who'd stumbled into his car by accident anymore. She was, without anyone officially declaring it, the person the entire investigation now revolved around. Piece by piece, the full picture assembled itself. Hale's network stretched back nearly 6 years, touching over a dozen organizations across Illinois, each one contributing a small, carefully hidden piece to a laundering system disguised as ordinary shipping and charitable giving. The warehouses had never been used for anything explicitly illegal on paper. Cargo moved, deliveries were logged, invoices were filed. But cross-referenced against the donation cycles Olivia had tracked, the truth became impossible to deny. Hale had been using charitable donations as a hidden financial mechanism, timing them to coincide with shipments that quietly moved laundered money, disguised as legitimate cargo payments. It wasn't the kind of scheme that made headlines with dramatic heists or violent confrontations. It was worse, in a way, because it had worked precisely by exploiting trust. Trust in nonprofits. Trust in longtime business consultants. Trust in the slow, quiet relationships Hale had spent years carefully building before ever using them. Ethan's own logistics companies, once their compromised shipments had been fully documented, came out of the investigation in better standing than they'd started, precisely because they'd been the ones to uncover and expose the fraud rather than bury it. The compliance attorneys made sure every affected client, every partner company, understood exactly how the manipulation had occurred and exactly what steps Ethan's businesses had taken the moment they discovered it. Hearthline's board, meanwhile, sat through a private briefing that left several members visibly shaken. The organization they'd trusted for years had been unknowingly financing a piece of Hale's operation without a single person on the board realizing it. But the relief in the room was just as visible once the full documentation was laid out. Every missing dollar could finally be traced. Every donor's contribution could finally be accounted for. The organization's name, rather than being dragged through scandal, would instead be remembered as the place where the entire scheme first started unraveling. By the end of the week, the case had grown too large and too well documented for Hale to outrun any longer. He'd dissolved companies, wiped servers, and scattered assets across accounts that took investigators weeks to fully trace. But every one of those desperate moves only added to the mountain of evidence against him. Financial regulators, once presented with the complete timeline, moved quickly. Within days, formal charges were filed, and the network Hale had spent 6 patient years building collapsed entirely, exposed by the very organizations he'd once used as cover. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no tense meeting where Hale finally realized he'd been caught. He simply disappeared from public view the moment the investigation became official, leaving behind empty offices and unanswered calls. His carefully built reputation dismantled by a stack of handwritten notebooks he'd never known existed. Olivia sat in Ethan's office late one evening, the case finally closed, staring at the notebooks now sitting in a neat row on his desk. Evidence in an ongoing legal process, but no longer the fragile, private thing she'd carried everywhere for months. "It's strange," she said quietly. "All of this started because I got in the wrong car." Ethan looked at her, something warm settling behind the calm exterior he usually kept in place. "It started because you noticed something everyone else would have ignored. The wrong car just happened to be the reason I was there to hear it." She smiled faintly, exhaustion and relief mixing together after weeks of tension finally beginning to ease. "Guess I should be more careful about which Ubers I climb into from now on." "Or," Ethan said, "you could keep climbing into the wrong ones. Statistically, it's worked out pretty well so far." Olivia laughed, the first easy, unguarded laugh she'd allowed herself in what felt like months, and for a moment, sitting in the quiet of his office, With the case finally behind them, neither of them thought about warehouses or shell companies or hidden financial trails. They thought, instead, about how strange and unexpected the past few weeks had been, and how neither of them was quite ready for whatever came next to end. Chicago settled back into its normal rhythm within a few weeks, the way cities always do, even after something enormous has quietly unfolded beneath the surface. The story of Hale's exposure made a small ripple in local financial news, a few articles praising the nonprofit and the logistics firm that had uncovered the fraud together. But for most people walking past Hearthline's modest office on any given morning, life simply continued as it always had. For Olivia, though, nothing felt quite the same. Her name had started circulating in ways she never expected. 2 accounting firms downtown reached out after hearing about her role in unraveling the scheme, offering positions with salaries that would have made her old, exhausted self weep with relief. A university even invited her to speak to a class of forensic accounting students about pattern recognition in financial fraud, an idea that still made her laugh a little every time she thought about it. Quiet, overworked Olivia Bennett, standing in front of a lecture hall. She turned down every offer. Ethan hadn't pushed her toward his own company. He'd learned enough about her by then to know that Olivia made decisions on her own terms, in her own time, and any attempt to sway her would likely have the opposite effect. So when she showed up at his office one afternoon, notebook in hand out of habit even though the case was closed, and told him she wanted the position as lead forensic accountant for one of his companies, helping build systems to catch fraud before it started, rather than untangling it after the fact, he simply nodded, like he'd been expecting it all along. "Good," he said. "Diane's already asked when you're starting. She likes you more than she likes most of the people who've worked for her for a decade." High praise. From Diane, extremely high praise. The work itself was different from anything Olivia had done before, less about reconstructing hidden fraud after the damage was done, and more about designing the kind of quiet, careful safeguards that made schemes like Hale's harder to build in the first place. She threw herself into it, the way she threw herself into everything, methodically, stubbornly, occasionally filling entire notebooks with ideas nobody had asked for, simply because she couldn't stop thinking about them. Somewhere in the middle of all that, without either of them officially deciding it, she and Ethan had stopped scheduling meetings and started simply spending time together. It happened slowly, the way most real things do. A late dinner, after a long day reviewing new compliance procedures, turned into 2 hours of conversation that had nothing to do with work at all. A walk along the lakefront one Saturday, meant to clear her head after a stressful week, turned into an entire afternoon wandering through the Art Institute, Ethan quietly amused by how strongly Olivia held opinions about impressionist paintings versus how uncertain she'd been the first time she'd tried to explain shell company structures to his legal team. They found a small used bookstore near her apartment that neither of them had known existed, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered flower shop, and made a habit of returning most weekends, browsing shelves in comfortable silence, before ending up at the tiny cafe 2 doors down. Ethan, it turned out, had a quiet fondness for old detective novels, something Olivia found endlessly amusing, given the very real mystery they'd just spent months solving together. "You'd think you'd had enough of solving crimes for one lifetime," she told him one afternoon, watching him flip through a worn paperback with a magnifying glass on the cover. "This one's fictional," he said, "much less paperwork." She laughed, and he looked up at the sound of it the way he always did now, like it was something worth pausing for. Neither of them rushed the shift from partnership into something more personal. It simply happened, unfolding across museum visits and lakefront walks and quiet evenings at neighborhood cafes, until one evening, sitting across from each other at a small Italian place 2 blocks from Hearthline, Ethan finally said what both of them had been circling around for weeks. "I liked you before I knew what you looked like," he admitted, turning his glass slowly on the table. "You were just a voice in the back of my car, talking about shell companies, like you were furious at them personally. I was fascinated before I ever really looked at you." Olivia felt something warm settle in her chest, unfamiliar and steady all at once. She'd spent years bracing herself for the moment men noticed her appearance before anything else, softened by the assumption that her size, her exhaustion, her ordinary, unglamorous life made her someone to be overlooked. Ethan had done the opposite from the very first night. He'd listened to her mind before he'd ever paid attention to anything else. "I think that might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me," she said quietly. "It's just true." Several weeks later, on an unremarkable Tuesday evening, Ethan picked her up from her apartment after a long day, the city lights blurring gently past the windows as they drove nowhere in particular, simply enjoying each other's company after the kind of week that used to exhaust her before this whole strange chapter of her life began. Olivia glanced over at him, a familiar mischief tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Just making sure," she said. "This is actually your car, right?" Ethan glanced sideways at her, the corner of his own mouth lifting in a way that had become entirely too familiar to her over the past few months. "This time," he said, "I hope you never get out." She laughed, the sound filling the quiet car, warm and easy in a way that felt nothing like the nervous, exhausted young woman who'd once climbed into the wrong SUV on a rainy Chicago night, desperate to get home after an impossible day. She hadn't been overlooked after all. She'd simply been waiting for someone who knew how to look properly, who saw the sharpness in her mind before anything else, who valued her handwriting in cheap notebooks more than any polished digital report his own team could produce. The rain that night had led her into the wrong car entirely by accident. It had turned out, in every way that mattered, to be exactly the right one.